Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to knock off a pair of jeans. The jeans I'm wearing are a pair of vintage Wranglers I picked up at the thrift store. I'm going to trace the pattern off, we're going to sew it together, we're going to make a muslin, and then I will show you the final product of me wearing my very own jeans knocked off from a pair of vintage Wranglers. So let's begin. Alright, so these are the jeans we are going to copy. They are a high-waisted vintage jean, and we are going to make the pattern suitable for heavy woven fabrics, just like denim. So you can use corduroy, twill, raw denim, whatever you want. But first, we need to look at our tools. Okay, so the tools pictured, you need pattern paper. You need a quilting ruler for graphing right angles. You need a French curve, some weights. You can use these fabric weights I have, or you can use soup cans. You need scotch tape. You need paper scissors. You need a mechanical pencil. You need a fabric notcher. That's optional. You need some markers, and you definitely need a pattern wheel or a tracer, and you need a surface to trace the wheel on so you don't puncture your table, and you need a tape measure. So let's begin by laying out our jeans on our pattern paper. We're going to spread these out nice and flat. We're going to make sure that the jeans are as flat as possible. Mine have a twist in them, so we're just going to work with that. And then we're going to trace the outside after we put our weights down to keep the jeans in place. Trace along the exact sewing seam where the garment has been sewn. Once we have our pattern traced out, we're going to add our seam allowance to that. Make sure you double check to, once you get to the thicker parts of the denim, you're going to want to make sure that the tracing wheel is puncturing all the way to the paper so you have a nice clear pattern trace. So when I get to these thicker parts, I have the jeans laid out flat, so we're just going to have to really make sure that the tracing wheel goes through all those layers of denim. And we're just going to trace the top here. I've got it in some speed motion, so you don't have to, you can get the gist of what I'm doing here in a faster motion. And yeah, I've double checked there, so just keep moving on. Make sure you try and get the corners of your pattern piece as good as possible. And one option is to pin your garment to the paper. This poses a problem for me because my jeans have a twist in them, but if your pants lay out nice and flat, an option is to pin one side of your pattern down just to keep it stable while you're tracing each side. That helps. I find that the weights are sufficient enough to keep the pants in place, and as well as using my hands to press the fabric out. But the trick is to get an accurate trace on your garment. If it's accurate when you trace it, you won't have to spend as much time reworking your pattern once you sew your prototype together, which is another name for a muslin. I mentioned muslin earlier, but it's a prototype of your pattern, usually made out of cheap fabric of the same weight as what your end product is going to be. And so for the crotch part, I'm just lightly or guessing where that's going because we're going to remeasure that after we can fold the jeans in half. So I sort of eyeballed the crotch part extension because the seam on the crotch kind of curves under, so I had to kind of guess there. And then now we're going to do the inseam. And this is where the pinning helps, but because mine's twisting, I've had to kind of adjust my tracing for that. And then now we're going to check the work that we've done, and I'm just going over to check my line, and now I'm just connecting all those dots there. Once I get the general outline of my pattern, then I'm going to go in and measure the jean and then apply those measurements to my pattern to see if it's accurate. And then you'll see me measure that crotch line as well before. I always start with the crotch part, which is where I'm laying my pants down. So this is the center back on the butt going into the crotch. We want to make sure that those angles and everything are accurate, because that's how our pants are going to fit the best, is if the crotch or the rise, and then that curve underneath the crotch there. If it's done properly, our jeans will fit the same. And now we're going to trace off the yoke. Now I'm tracing through quite a few layers of denim, so you want to really make sure that you get that tracing wheel pushed in there really accurately. The better I trace the pattern out, the less I'm going to have to go in and rework and true the pattern, which I show you after what truing is. But it's essentially just putting our pattern pieces in paper, our paper pattern pieces together, to make sure that they line up properly for sewing. And I've already done the front leg in the same manner, so you can go ahead and do the front leg, but now because there's this pocket facing here, you want to remember to trace off that pocket facing separately within the original trace of your front leg. So that's what I'm showing you how to do now. So I've already traced out the front leg exactly the way I did the back, and now I'm going through in and putting my pocket facing. And I just measured how much the pocket facing goes into the actual front pattern piece, because if it doesn't go in far enough, you're going to see your pocketing when you sew it together. So I'm tracing it, but then I'm also going to measure to see how much it is, just to be a little bit more accurate. And that's why I use this quilting ruler, because it has that grid pattern and it has 1/8 of an inch increments, which work really well for seam allowance. And then again, this is where the curve comes in. Now the French curve is optional, but if you like your lines to be nice and perfect, then I suggest getting a French curve. This one cost me about $10. And I can do a nice curved, like I can connect the dots a lot easier, and then you can also freehand it too, not a big deal if you have confident at drawing curved lines. So that's our outline for our pocket facing. A pocket facing doesn't need seam allowance on the inside. And you'll see that when I actually teach you how to sew it together, why that is. And then don't forget to trace the pocket as well. You want to make sure that you know your pocket opening on your pattern. So we got to trace that off, and that kind of goes within the facing here, but you can see I'm freehanding, and you can see it's a little off there. So I'm just going to adjust that so it has a nice even 1-inch spacing in between the pocket opening and the facing. The line that I'm doing there, that facing, that can be any kind of style. Like your jeans might look a little bit different than mine. Every company makes their inside pocket facing a little bit different. It doesn't have anything to do with the way your pants fit. The way that your pants fit has to do with the top waistband, the crotch area, and the side hip seam, the side seam, and then the inseam. This pattern piece you can make however you want. Just make sure that it goes within the pocket opening enough so that you don't see your pocketing, if maybe you want to see your pocketing though. So I've outlined it with red there because I want to make sure that when I trace it out, I remember to do that. I always forget to trace that out and make a pattern piece out of it when I design jeans. So I do it in red, and you'll see I even forget it this time. So now we're just doing the back pocket. Back pocket's pretty straightforward. Once I trace it out, I draw balance lines. So I draw a center line down the center of the pocket, and then I draw 2 horizontal lines to make sure each corner is balanced with each other, so I have a nice symmetrical pocket. And again, this is why I use the quilting ruler, because it has those right angles in it and it allows me to see everything. So I'm basically using the ruler to connect the dots of what I just traced, and then before I finalize that pattern, I'm going to draw those balance lines in from the bottom corner of the pocket and then in the center of the pocket. You can see those. So it's pretty straightforward. You just connect the dots, connect the lines, and then you have a nice symmetrical pocket. And you can label that if you want, if you need to remember. Now we're going to do the inside pocketing. Okay, so we call this in the industry pocketing or a pocket. The fabric that we would use is called pocketing. Can be really any fabric you want, just make sure it's lightweight. And everyone's inside pocket is different. This particular pattern piece has been folded and then stitched together. So we're going to copy that. It's a super easy way to do. I'm going to trace off one side of the pocket, and then I'm going to create a center line where I'm going to sort of spread that pattern out and create almost like a butterfly version of that one piece, so that when I cut it out on my pattern, I only need to cut out one piece rather than two and then sew them together. But your pocket on your jeans might look a little different than mine. Most commercially produced clothing are done in a way that they reduce the sewing line, the sewing time, so they try and cut down as much stitching as possible to save time making the clothes so that they are as cheap as possible. So tracing off the pocket, everything is done always the same. You put your weights down. If you have nice weights like this or heavy soup cans, you don't really need to pin your garment to the paper. I don't like to because I've ripped paper putting pins in it before, so I'm like, I don't want holes in my pattern. And tracing it freehand, I mark it to make sure it's my inside pocket so I don't throw that piece of paper away accidentally. I've done that. Then you're looking for your pattern piece. Okay, draw a nice straight line. That line that I just drew, that is our fold line on our pattern. Okay, so I've got one piece, and now I need to create the other side. So it's pretty easy to do. After I mark this in, now you can use your curved ruler if you want to make that line nice and sharp. I've freehanded it, so I'm not too worried about it. Now I'm going to take another piece of paper, tape it to that straight folded edge, and then we're going to just first check to make sure I have enough paper, because I've done that before too, where I've taped another piece of paper together and the pattern didn't match, it wasn't big enough. Always save your scrap paper. You never know when you're going to need it, and you'll understand that later on when you start getting used to making your own patterns, or if you're already pretty advanced making your patterns already, you know why you have to save all your paper. It seems wasteful, all this paper I use, but I actually don't really throw a lot of paper away. Mostly just the big scraps I always keep. And because I like my lines to be nice and sharp, I just go over it with my French curve nice and quick, but this is a purely optional, but I do recommend getting a French curve again. Okay, so we're going to fold this pattern in half and then pin our two pieces of paper together and cut it out. Pretty easy. I recommend doing the seam allowance before you do that though. Anytime you're cutting out a pattern, you want to make sure you put your seam allowance on it, because if you don't have seam allowance, you're going to have to use a bunch of scrap piece of paper, tape some paper on, and then add the seam allowance, okay? Because if you don't, your pattern's going to shrink when you sew it. So a little note about seam allowance. Now you can watch my video about seam allowance that I'm going to make, but you can also take a little note if you don't know. Seam allowance is the amount of seam, the amount of fabric that you need for when you sew your seam together, okay? Now it can vary, but standard seam allowance for jeans is usually 1 centimeter, and if that's metric, it's 5/8, or it's 1.5 centimeters, or 3/4 of an inch. So on the outside of the pocket here, I'm doing 3/4 of an inch because I have a 5-thread serger, and that is usually a pretty thicker, like it's a wider seam. So I want to make sure that I have enough fabric, or because it's 3/4 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters, I also have the option of doing a French seam or a flat felled seam as well. In the waistband, I always do a 1-inch seam allowance because I do not use a serger to attach my waistband onto my jeans. So I use a standard 1 centimeter 5/8 seam allowance here on the waistband. I'm but seam allowance is up to you. It usually depends on your sewing machine or your serger that you're using, and that's going to determine how much seam allowance you use. But it's very important because say you've designed a pattern and you think it's going to fit well and you've not added enough seam allowance to it, you've only added 1 centimeter, and say your serger actually uses more than 1 centimeter or 5/8, then your pattern's going to be smaller, or your garment's going to be smaller once it's sewn together. So that's why seam allowance is important. I always say lean on more seam allowance or just make it as standard as possible. Now we're going to cut out our pattern here. So you can see I pinned the 2 pieces together just to make sure that it's stable when I cut it out. And then I cut out, this is a finished pattern, okay? It has seam allowance on it, and we've cut it out. So because it's finished, we're going to draw a grain line on it so that we know that when I know that when I lay that pattern down on my fabric, it's going in the right direction of the grain. That's really important because if your grain is off center, or if it's not completely horizontal, vertical, your pattern, once it's washed, or your garment once it's washed rather, it'll twist like my jeans were twisting. If your pattern piece has been cut out perfectly on the grain, your pants are going to lay really nice. They're going to sit really nice, they're going to wash, and they're going to fold nice. There you have it, our finished pattern piece. I labeled it too in black marker, and I've indicated that I need to cut 2 of these out. Okay, so now we're going to do the fly facing. This is a standard jean fly, and a jean fly has a facing, which I'm measuring there, and then it has another facing which gets attached to the other pant piece to stabilize the zipper and create weight and stability and strength in the fly so that it has durability. I don't need to trace this pattern piece out because a fly facing is the length of the zipper that you're going to use plus about 1 inch. So you want to make sure that if you want to copy these jeans exactly to how they're made, that you make sure you get a zipper that's the same as your jean. Now I have one that's the same length as my jean, so I don't need to worry. I can design my fly facing the same as the jeans, but if your zipper was a little bit smaller, your facing doesn't necessarily have to be a little bit smaller, but you might have some excess bulk in your fly on the crotch of your jeans that you might not want, so you might have to make your facing a little smaller. So this facing is again, it's a butterflied pattern piece, so it's folded, and I've measured out one side of my fly facing, and I've just doubled that, and then I add the seam allowance to the outside, the perimeter. So I do the 1 centimeter seam allowance on my fly facing because it's a standard seam allowance, so it's 5/8, 1 centimeter. I excuse my use of metric for all of you not used to metric. I try and use imperial as well. I am from Canada, but I know that in garment manufacturing it's always done in imperial measurements, but I usually do my pattern drafting in centimeters because it is in metric, I'd rather, because it's a little more exact down to the millimeter. So you can see I'm finishing off my fly facing here, and it's just a square for now. I'm designing it as a square, but I like to do a half circled edge, exactly like you see the stitching on the front of jeans, so that when I'm sewing, and you'll see when I sew the fly front in, you'll see why I do a curved edge on my fly facing. On most commercial jeans, they don't do that. They'll like tuck a piece under and then tack it down, and I think that creates a lot of unnecessary bulk in the crotch. Unless you want some bulk in your crotch, then go ahead. Not all of us do. So when I draw my grain line on there, that indicates to me that that pattern is done because I'm finishing it. So I've drawn the grain line and I'm gonna mark it with my black marker. Now for the other facing that goes on the opposite side of the zipper, you're gonna just draw one, it's gonna be the same as this piece, but it's not going to be folded. It's just going to be a single layer of fabric. So it's basically the same exact piece of fabric, but one is folded in half and the other one's just a single piece, and it gets a fusing on it. So you'll know what that looks like when I actually sew the jeans together. I'm going to talk about the fusing and all that stuff, but for now we're just tracing off our pieces. Now I want to make sure that my pocket's finished too, so I'm going to add the seam allowance to that. And I'm using a standard seam allowance, okay? Standard seam allowance is 5/8 or 1 centimeter. So I'm just doing a standard, but on the top, we need to double fold the top of the pocket because I don't want to see serging, and I want to create like a kind of a heavier pocket hem. So on the top, and most jeans have this, they'll just double fold a 5/8 piece. So I've just doubled, so 2 centimeters, or 2 5/8, 10/16. And then cut that out and draw your, again, grain line in red. Well, I was taught to do it in red, so that you always know that your pieces are laying. Now, sometimes your grain line is going to be in a different direction. Like say if you want to cut a pocket on the bias, which means on the diagonal, your grain line is going to be drawn on a diagonal. It's not always going to be straight down the center, vertical. Pretty pocket. Don't forget to write on it. Yeah, get that ruler. All right. For pattern drafting, you're gonna need a black marker, a red marker, and actually a green one. And the green one you put on pattern pieces that indicate that you need to put a fusing on it. So any pattern piece that needs fusing gets a green marker as well. So you indicate how much you cut, what the pattern piece is, how many of them you have to cut. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 1 or whatever. And then if it needs fusing, you put the fusing on it too. So what I'm doing now, I'm drawing a balance line on my leg, back leg pattern, and I'm doing this on the front leg as well. These balance lines are going to come in really handy in case something goes wrong with our tracing. So to determine the center one, I draw it within the center of the knee, just so that at least it's kind of generally going down the center of what I've traced out. And if you're wondering where the knee is, we just look on our jeans and just kind of measure it from there. And then I do another balance line from the crotch to the outer hip. The reason why I draw the first one down the center is so that you want to make sure everything's at a right angle, right? So if you measure completely in the center of your knee, draw a mark, and then a couple inches down you draw another mark completely the center, then you join those 2 marks, and then you'll get a nice straight line vertically, and then you can just intersect that line perpendicularly at the crotch there, and those are going to be your balance lines. So now that we have our balance lines measured out, we want to check our pattern for accuracy. Okay, if we skip this step, your pants are going to fit super wonky. They're not going to fit like our copy. So I always start from the top, and I make sure that that's measured nice, and always measure twice or sometimes 3 times. I usually measure 3 times because sometimes I'll get like different measurements each time. So then you keep measuring until it comes out the same, basically. So I measure the top, okay, and it works. So I'm going to finalize it with a sharp line. So once I've gone over it with my ruler, to me in my head, that means that that section has been checked, basically. And then the next, to connect the top corner to our hip line where we've drawn that balance line, we're going to measure the crotch, but first we're going to measure the center back, because we want to make sure that this center back part seam is done exactly like our pattern, because this is going to be the most important part of our jeans and how they fit. If this is too short, our jeans are going to fit weird on our butt. They're not going to fit like our copy, right? Like our original copy. So this is a really important part. And you'll see that I think I might have edited that out, but I've measured this like 5 times just to make sure it was accurate. And what I'm doing here with my tape measure is I'm laying it vertically onto the paper so that I can draw, so that I can measure around the curve. If you lay it out flat and try and measure the curve, your measurement won't be accurate. So lay it vertically on your piece of paper and follow that exact line. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm just measuring the curve to match it to my jean, to make sure that the curve's the same. That's very important. Sometimes I've done it where like the crotch rise has been, or the curve has been too much, and then I get like a saggy, like poopy butt. So you want to make sure that that's done just like in the pattern. And when we do our muslin and our prototype and we fit it on, if it doesn't fit right, we're gonna have to alter a lot of things. And when you watch the next video and I make my toile or my muslin or my prototype, whatever you want to call it, hopefully if it doesn't fit right, well, it's going to be a great video for you guys to watch, because I'm going to have to alter my toile and make another toile after I make the corrections on my pattern. So I did the center, I keep calling it the crotch, but it's actually the butt and then the crotch, or the underbutt, whatever you want to call it. So make sure when you're measuring across from the crotch to the hip that you're going completely horizontally across the jean. You can sometimes, if you're not being accurate, it could sort of be on an angle, and that's going to mess up your mess up your measurement. But my issue that I'm having with these jeans is that there's about an inch extra, so I can't just lay them out flat and measure them, because it curls around the edge of the side seam. The side seam's like under by about 2 inches, so I basically have to like lay it out and run it along with my fingers. If someone that you know can wear the jeans for you while you measure, that'll definitely help a lot when you're measuring your pattern, if you're running into issues like this. But I mean, obviously a lot of the times they say to measure them laying flat on a table, and that's great, but sometimes you run into problems, and that's why you want to measure it like 3 or 4 times to make sure you keep getting the same measurement, which I'm doing. I kept getting the same measurement, and so my tracing was off by about 2.5 centimeters. And this is why you want to measure your jeans and apply that measurement to your tracing, because if I was to just trace it and cut it out, then my pants would be off. They'd be off by 2.5 centimeters. Like, I wouldn't even be able to pull them on. So what I'm doing here is I'm applying that new measurement, and I'm going from the center out to the side seam. The reason why I'm doing that is because the side seam is very easy to alter, but the crotch area and the center back area isn't the easiest. So we want to make sure that is the most accurate, and then any alterations we can do on the outside side seam, that helps a lot. And also the inside, the inseam as well. So I've measured that crotch out to the hip, and now I'm going to check my inseam, okay? And then I work out from there. But first, we measure the knee. I probably should have done the inseam as well, but we're gonna just do the knee as well because I'm working across horizontally. So I did the crotch, the knee. These are, when you actually draft a pattern from scratch, those are the points as well that you start off with, and then you connect everything to them. So I do have some knowledge in pattern design. I've designed a lot of my own pants before, and I'm applying that knowledge to my tracing. So if you are super confused about what I'm doing, just make sure you leave a comment. I don't mind answering any questions. I want to help you guys make all your own clothes at home for yourself in the easiest way possible without the use of commercial patterns. Like, how satisfying is it to be able to copy your favorite pair of jeans that you already have at home? Like, I found these jeans randomly in Calgary, and I have not been able to find good jeans like this ever since, so that's why I'm copying them. So I am drawing my outside seam. Okay, I probably should have done the inside seam, but if you recall, my tracing was done and it was easy to trace the inside seam, whereas the outside hip seam was the one that was folding under. So this is the one that because I've got the inseam and the crotch or the center back seam good, I can just trace those off and then just check the curve of them against my actual pattern, or at my actual garment, sorry. And then I can do any changes or updates to my measurements on the outside seam. That's the easiest to alter. And in the next video, we're going to go into any sort of fit issues. So this video is just purely for tracing out, getting our jeans that we love onto paper and into a pattern. Once we get that pattern, we can start making it into our prototype, where we use that really inexpensive fabric. I ended up buying cotton muslin because where I live, I can't find cheap prototype fabric, but don't spend more than like a couple of dollars a meter or a yard on this fabric. Just don't get anything that's super slippery unless you plan on making like PVC pants. Then you can get like a cheaper kind of PVC fabric, like that's totally fine. Your prototype should sort of be as close to the final fabric that you plan on using as possible. That's why I like cotton muslin. It's kind of like a generic whatever, and I found a really inexpensive place to buy it here in Canada. So now I'm adding my seam allowance, and if you remember, I'm only doing 5/8 seam allowance on the waistband, which is the top. But here on my pants, I actually screwed up because I thought that was the waistband, but it's actually where the yoke is going to be. So it actually should be 3/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. And then on your hem, which is the bottom, you usually do 1 inch because you want to do a double fold, or you can do a single fold, but you want that hem to be at least 1 inch. But the hem can be whatever. I recommend if you can make the hem longer, you can make it cropped. Like, the hem is probably the easiest part of the jean because it's just a square, or maybe you want to do a bell bottom or whatever. The hem you can kind of alter whatever you want, but any alterations to the hem, like if you're making it wider, you do it from around the knee area or from that hip line that I've drawn, where I've drawn that top line at the hip. So I'm done, obviously, because I drew my grain line. Now I'm labeling my pattern. So whenever I do that, that means it's done. I'm cutting 2, and I'm going to cut it out. So that's nice. And remember, if you have any questions, leave any comments that you need in the comment. I will try and answer all your questions, or let me know if this worked for you. That would be nice as well. We'll see if it works for me, but I love sewing. I like doing patterns, so I mean, I could do this all day, all the time, right? Now, I already told you that I traced out the front. You see how nice the front lays down on my paper? Like, this one was easy to trace. It's not gonna be like a big headache trying to balance it and measure everything, because it just traced out so nicely on the piece of paper. So I don't have to, but I'm still doing my balance lines, okay? You want these these are, when you draft a pattern, you put these balance lines down when you first do your pattern. So that's why I'm putting them on my, or when you first do your like draft rather, a pattern is when it's finalized, all right? So we're kind of working backwards. We're tracing out a finished pattern, and then we're drawing those like design balance lines in after. And we do that from drawing something up the center to get the pattern at least centered at the knee. And then once we know that that is a completely horizontal line, we don't want it crooked. If it's crooked, our pattern's going to be off, right? You want it completely at right angles from each other. That's why the quilting angle helps. And again, I'm doing the same thing at the crotch in the front as I did in the back, okay? Measuring the crotch, checking the curve, and making sure everything lines up. I want this to be as close to my pattern as possible because it's going to fit the closest. I'm going to have less headaches when I make my prototype with the cotton muslin, which we're going to do in the next video. And again, you lay your, what is it? A tape. You lay your tape measure down vertically on the paper, and to make sure you can follow that curve. And then again, I like to use my French curve just to give it a nice clean line because I like sharp lines on my pattern. All right, yeah, fold it in half, check. It doesn't matter. I usually use like when you open a fly, you have the front and then the under part. I usually use the top piece to check my line. You don't really want to use the under piece because yeah, it has a zipper on it. It's not easy to follow the edge of the seam as easily. So what might help is if the pants are actually closed as well. I don't believe mine are closed. So if they're zipped up and buttoned up, that'll be a lot easier for you as well. Yeah, they're not closed. Okay, so we've got our rough layout. And if you notice, I still haven't traced out my facing yet, so yeah, you're gonna have to remember to do that. It's always good to just trace it out as soon as you draw it out like that, but it's always something I tend to forget when I'm designing clothes. So I recommend going over your traced pattern with a ruler. This is going to be a lot easier for you to draw in your seam allowance when you have a nice clean line. That's why you don't want to just do your seam allowance against a wobbly, like hand traced line. You want to make sure that line is sharp and clean. And this is where the curve comes in, and this is where your rulers come in. So I didn't mention before, but you need a meter stick as well, or a yardstick. So make sure you have a yardstick, like again, a quilting ruler, a right angle ruler. Why am I forgetting what that's called right now? I used to have one, but I think I left it in the studio. I just realized that, how annoying. That ruler was expensive. Yeah, I left my good rulers at some studio. Oh, anyways. So just draw your straight lines. Again, my hem. If you're doing a straight leg jean, the bottom cuff of your pant should be at right angles. When you do a bell bottom or a taper, obviously that's different, but these jeans are straight leg, so the bottom hem is at right angles, so it's completely square. And I've added a 1-inch hem to my pant. And a 1.5-inch seam allowance, no, 3/4 inch seam allowance, 1.5 centimeters on the inseam, the outside seam, and the crotch, or the center front seam. They all get a 3/4 inch seam allowance, or 1.5 centimeters, okay? It's only where the waistband is that gets a 1 centimeter or 5/8, and then the hem gets a 1 inch, or whatever that is in centimeters. So what we're doing now is we're truing our pattern. So truing is basically just a term where you match up the sewing lines of your pattern, not the seam allowance lines, the sewing lines. And you take a bodkin, I think it's called, and it's like a stabby thing with a wooden nub, a handle. It's not a necessity in pattern design, but it makes your life a lot easier, because when you're drafting patterns, you always have to true your seams, and you need a bodkin, I think that's what it's called, in order to do that. Okay, so I laid my pieces down, and I did this kind of fast, but the inseam matched up really nice, so that's why I'm cutting it out. And you'll see that what I run into problems with, and this will happen when you trace out your patterns, no matter how good you think it is, when you true the seams, which is the sewing lines, it might not line up perfectly, and then this is where your pattern drafting skills come into play, and this is why we draw those balance lines on there, because you're going to see I do a method called slash and spread, because the outside seams aren't lining up when I true my pattern together. And when you true the pattern, you basically are imagining yourself sewing the cut fabric together, but you're doing it on paper. So here I go to cut out my pattern, and I've realized, oh, I haven't traced out the facing yet. So facing, remember, now that I've already added the seam allowance, tracing it out is going to be a lot better, because I just have to trace out one thing. I don't have to add seam allowance or nothing to it. And so I just got to trace it out, draw my, mark my grain line, and label the pattern piece. There we go. And then we are going to draw our seam allowance to our pocket opening, all right? So do not forget to do this. I have done this many times, and I've gone to cut out my pattern, and then I realized that I don't have a seam allowance on my pocket. So it's not really going to affect, you're just going to have a giant pocket opening, basically, if you end up doing that. But I like to have a standard pocket opening, like I want it to match my jeans, right? I don't want this giant pocket gaping open, so make sure you add your seam allowance on your pocket, basically. And make sure you add the pocket opening onto your pocket facing piece as well. I didn't show you that in the earlier, but one side of that folded pocket needs to have that pocket opening on it as well, so that yeah. But that's easy. I can just lay that down on that pocket opening now that it's been seam allowanced, and I can just draw the line in and cut it. So easy. There's my bodkin rolling around, and what I'm doing is I'm truing the yoke onto the back, and you can see it's off by, I don't know, what is that, like 2 centimeters? Like, it's a lot. So I true it from the center out to the hip again, because from the center we want it to line up nicely, and then we can alter whatever we need to at the hip curve. So that's where I'm going to add the fabric. I wouldn't do it from the outside hip curve and then add to the center, because we've measured that line already. We know that that line is good, but what is off is the way that we trace the outside. So that's why I'm just going to do it to the outside here and add the excess onto that. And I'm just going to tape a piece of paper on there and just match it, and continue the line of my pattern out to the new piece of paper. Super easy. And then that way when we sew it together, it won't be off by 2 centimeters when we sew it together, because if we're missing 2 centimeters of fabric, what are we going to do, right? This is like, first you kind of like sew it, quote unquote, with your paper by like, I'll tape the pieces together. Always tape them together at the stitching line, not the seam allowance line. So when I'm truing my pattern piece, I've laid the 2 stitch lines over top of each other, and then I true it. I don't true it from the seam allowance. So now I'm going to true the outside seam. So you can see I start doing, like, you got to tape the yoke piece onto your back pattern because what I'm doing here does not make any sense. So make sure you tape the yoke onto your pattern piece on the back, tape the pocket facing on there, and then true your side seam because yeah, if you don't do that, it's not going to make any sense. And then again, true it at the stitching line, like where you're going to sew along, which is outlined there. That's where we traced, if you remember. So that's where we traced, where our tracing line is, that's where it's been stitched. And that's what we're also truing. And then we're going to use our bodkin. When we true it, we're going to stab our bodkin, walk our bodkin along the stitching line, and then we're going to rotate our pattern to match the curve, just like we would be sewing it together. So imagine that you're kind of sewing your pattern together, but it's paper. And then we're making sure it lines up. I keep going on and on about truing, but it's very important. It saves you a lot of headaches if you do this. If you skip this point, you're going to sew your pattern together, and then you're going to be like, oh my goodness, it's off by like an inch, and what the heck did I do? Well, if you didn't, it's because you didn't true your pattern. You didn't check. You know, not everyone measures accurately, right? But we can make sure that we can be accurate in our measuring and our truing, and that's what I'm doing here. So now I've noticed that my side seam has been off. So what I've done is I've cut along that balance line at the hip. You can see my little cut line, and I didn't cut the whole pattern. I just cut right to the edge of the other stitch line so I can open it up like a pie, right? And then I'm measuring along. What I've done is I've trued it. Okay, and then I've taken the measurement of what was off. So I'm going to do that again. I'm going to measure. It's off and I don't know why. Okay, so I'm measuring each stitch line separately with my measuring tape. And then I'm marking the difference down on a piece of paper. And then what I'm doing is I'm adding that difference into the part that I've slashed. So I'm opening my pattern that distance. So what I've gotten is one side is 2 centimeters longer than the other. So the front seems to be 2 centimeters shorter than the back. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking that 2 centimeters, I'm marking it onto a little piece of paper like this, and then I'm taping that paper onto the open seam. So what I'm doing is I'm sort of taping one side of the cut line to the one measurement point, and then I'm opening my pattern and matching it to the other measurement point. So I'm slashing the pattern and spreading it open. And this is how you can fix any differences or errors in your measuring without actually ruining the, like, you can actually adjust the fit of your pattern better. If I was to just add the 2 centimeters down at the bottom, that wouldn't be very accurate because I already know that the bottom of my pattern lines up really nice. So somewhere in the middle is where I've gone wrong, and it's usually at that hip point where the crotch is, and it's a little bit more of an advanced thing, but it's actually really fun once you get it. So I'll do some more slashing and spreading in another video. This is just a little intro, but I've added the difference that the two patterns were matching up, and I've added that to the side at the hip there, and I noticed that I get a much nicer shape of my pattern after from doing this. And it doesn't affect my pocket pattern piece. It doesn't affect anything. It just makes sure that the side seams match up really nicely. So I've taped one side to that measurement point that I was talking about, and I'm taping the whole piece of the whole pattern down, and then I'm taping it down to the other measurement point that I've indicated on that little strip of paper that I'm taping down. And that's how I know that I'm adding that 2 centimeters into my pattern. So that's the final part. Now we're just going to make sure that we true our side seams once more, just to make sure that I'm just cleaning up my pattern in that corner that you can't see off camera there. And we're just going to true our side seams one more time because you want to make sure that they're nice and matching. So when I sew these together, I don't have any issues. And it should line up quite nicely. I think I actually had to do both pattern pieces. They were kind of off. It might have been so off that I sort of split the difference. I added a centimeter to the back and 2 centimeters to the front. Like, I honestly think it was off by that much. So now we're good. So those are our pattern pieces done. Don't forget to add our pocket opening, your pocket opening. Well, I shouldn't forget to add my pocket opening to my pocket piece, and then that should be ready to go. How exciting.